ไม่ค่อยดีอังโคสติสังฆาโตธัมมานังวิจโยตถาวิริยัมปิติปัสสัตติโพจังกา
Good morning, everyone. This is the fifth talk on the sixth Bhojjanga, and the day for the sixth Bhojjanga Samādhi is Saturday, and it happens that today is Saturday, so maybe that's a good sign for what we might talk about. So the Buddha Rupa for Saturday for Samādhi is the Buddha being shielded by the Naga, and so it's called the Itai Pranak Prog, Buddha protected by Naga. This one is beautiful detail, but I don't think it's terribly old, and I'm not quite sure where it's. I think it's in the private collection. It's made of silver. Beautiful detail. This one is in a cave. Some of the most interesting Buddha Rupas are in caves. This one is a cave in Phetchaburi, which is 100 to 200 miles southwest of Bangkok. This one is older, but I have no idea exactly how old, because quite a lot of these have had lots of restoration. And the third one, now this one is definitely modern and huge in Laos, just over the border from Thailand. So this Buddha image for Samādhi, the Buddha image for Samādhi it actually follows in the stories associated with it to the one for Passaddhi that we talked about last time. And they both relate to the 7 weeks of the Buddha's enlightenment, following the Buddha's enlightenment, mostly around I think entirely around the Bodhi tree. So the one we talked about last week was the occasion when the Buddha gave a Dhamma talk to who turned out to be his first two lay disciples. And he reflected on teaching, how difficult it would be because the subtlety of the Dhamma. Then he reflected on Passaddhi, which arises when someone connects to Dhamma, and which can happen in listening to a Dhamma talk if it's taught well. And that's what we talked about last time. And then after those 7 days, he moved to another tree, sat under another tree, and went into Samādhi, and was protected by the Naga king. So in this case, the two Bhojjangas, Passaddhi and Samādhi, they follow two events in these stories of the Buddha's enlightenment. They also correspond to the way the factors develop in meditation. Samādhi following the completion of or laying the foundation with the previous Bhojjangas. And I like to think the order of the chants in the Bhojjanga chant, we should probably all know. The first 3 lines of the Bhojjanga chant, I find it very kind of appropriate, and I doubt if it's an accident that the first 2 come together in the first line, Bojjango Sati Sankato Dhammanam Vichayo Datta. So Sati and Dhamma Vichaya. And then in the second line, Viryam Piti Passaddhi Bhojjanga Jatata Pare. The 3 Viryam, Virya, Piti, Passaddhi occur together, as we talked about them. And then the third line, the final two Bhojjangas, Samādhi Unupeka, Samadhupeka Bhojjanga, Sate Te Sapadasina. So the first two factors, when we talked about them, Sama, Dhamma, Vichaya, they establish attention, and they also establish Vitakka and Vichara, the first two jhana factors. And they represent the first stages of separating or disengaging from our ordinary, everyday sensory consciousness, and then develop the first Rupa jhana. These first stages of developing Vitakka and Vichara, mostly through the counting and following, are crucial because they establish the foundation for everything that follows. If they're rushed, if we rush those early stages, then we risk leading to incomplete separation from sensory consciousness, and the experience of jhana might be distorted, and we may not understand it properly. But if they are developed sufficiently, Vitakka and Vichara, and the first Rupa jhana develops, and someone becomes more confident of the experience, doesn't get pulled back into thinking, discrimination, naming, then everything from that point is freed to unfold. So the Virya, Piti, Passaddhi, the next three Bhojjangas, and also the second and higher Rupa jhanas, are free to unfold. Samādhi. Samādhi is often translated as concentration. But when it comes to developing the jhanas, it's a pretty poor translation. Yes, Samādhi is not exactly just concentration. Of course, it's related to concentration, but in developing the jhanas, it's much more similar to a better translation, actually, might be simply yoga. Because the two roots that form Samādhi, Sama, which means together, and Da is to place. They mean placing together, bringing together. And the point at which we establish Samādhi, everything starts to come together. Until eventually, when it's complete, when it's in its fulfillment, nothing is left out. And from the brain study, the EEG study, which I'll show you later, this is actually very evident in the networks of the brain that in the third Rupa jhana, for example, all the activity becomes focused into very clearly defined vertical axis centered around the top of the head. Very, very slow rhythms. So the time scale is quite different to sensory consciousness. Everything feels expansive in time. The ordinary sense of time changes. And all the networks that previously supported sensory consciousness have gone pretty well when the third Rupa jhana is complete. So, thinking of this talk on Samādhi, we've talked about the 5 preceding Bhojjangas. And you've all listened patiently to these talks, and we've practiced. And in the practice, we haven't really used stages. I suggested that people allow the stillness to develop and see where it goes. You could say now, at this point, on the 6th Bhojjanga, everything we've done talking about the previous 5 is very similar to a kind of invocation. We talked about the Bhojjangas in order. We set up a kind of structure. It's a little bit like coming to the point where Vitakka and Vichara are in balance, and we don't have to worry about them in detail. They're okay, they're supporting our practice. And in the same way, at this point, when we're talking about Samādhi, the previous Bhojjangas have been talked about and established at least to some degree. And so Samadhi is free to unfold, to come together. The kind of practice we've done in this series of talks, I haven't talked about the first, second, third, fourth Rupa jhana during the practice. I simply said, allow your own practice to deepen. And it's a little bit like saying, allow jhana to deepen without the word first, second, third, fourth. Allow jhana to deepen. And I'm not suggesting that this should now become your normal practice, but it's very instructive to, when you've got a reasonable amount of experience, to do this and see how you experience it. And it's surprisingly tricky to begin with. I mean, for example, when you're developing the first Rupa jhana, every one of you will have had the experience, I'm sure, where you're trying patiently to develop attention, vitakka and vichara. And then the next moment you're pulled back into a kind of checking. It's like a kind of moment of reflection, but really it's a kind of checking. Where am I? What's going on? And that comes from the threshold of sensory consciousness, because sensory consciousness is ordered in time and space. There's a time order and there's a position in space. And the whole thing is, if you think about it, is mediated by language. There's a subject, I, there's a verb, and there's an action or an object, which is a series in time. Subject, verb, object. So to let go of that is quite a challenge. We could feel insecure to begin with. And so it needs getting used to. Usually the first Rupa jhana is the transition point, where you get a sufficient feel of contentment and less clutter from starting to be free of sensory consciousness, that the stillness deepens, and then you're in a way, you're on your way. And stillness that we talk about, which deepens, but it's there in all the jhanas. Stillness is, if you like, the signature of jhana. So when we practice today again, and you may want to try this occasionally in your own practice, what's it like to let go of the labels, the stages, to let go effectively of the sense of place and time, and see whether the experience is enough, the experience of stillness is enough to lead us deeper into absorption, into samadhi. So samadhi in this case is very, very different to our ordinary sensory consciousness. Effectively, we're talking about jhana consciousness and how it develops. And Boomman, if he was here, would be asking you, what does it look like? And actually, I can show you what it looks like in the EEG records. So again, I'll try and share the screen. Okay, I'm going to show you two recordings. This one is someone who is developing the second Rupa jhana, or trying to develop the second. Actually, it's on the boundary between the first and second. And as it develops, from about 40 seconds on, then you can see very strong slow waves developing. These are about, the peak of them is probably about 600 microvolts. So that's about 10 times, more than 10 times with 20 times the normal resting state levels. And if you look at what's going on across the head as a whole by doing the spectrum, it looks like this. So these are the maps of intensity across the head. That's the nose at the front. So it's looking at the head from the top. And the left one here is the very low frequencies. So pretty well everything is dominated now by very low frequencies. And those very low frequencies, if you look at the time scale, the top here, the time scale is, that is 10 seconds. So between peaks, it's about 10 to 20 seconds. Very slow. So once this is established, it's much easier to resist being pulled back into thinking, because the time scale of sensory consciousness, of the mode of thinking, is about 100 microseconds. Sorry, 100 milliseconds. Yeah, 100 milliseconds, which is the reaction time. So the time sense here, the time scale factor, is from about 100 milliseconds up to about 10 to 20 seconds. So it's 100 times slower. And the activity is almost all in the low frequency band. And there's a very strong intensity spot at the crown of the head. But not just the crown of the head yet for this meditator. There's still some at the back of the head. And the central intensity extends upwards into the frontal parietal area. No, actually frontal temporal area. But everything else is pretty well gone. The alpha, which is the normal resting state in sensory consciousness, is pretty well dead compared to the intensities here. So is theta, so is beta 1 and beta 2 are related to thinking. In fact, everything has pretty well disappeared. So this person is doing pretty well in developing the second Rupa jhana. Another analysis can work out the power, the percentage of power in that hot spot at the top of the head. And for this meditator, it's probably around, from memory, I think about 60 or 70% of the power in the brain networks is at the crown of the head. But this, you can see here, this is the second Rupa jhana is still prone to some piti getting a little bit out of control. You can see spike waves here. So it's not complete yet, but pretty good. The next one is someone who is developing the same from the first to the second Rupa jhana. You can start to see slow waves developing. They're actually stronger than they look because the scale here is 300 microvolts. You can see them at the back of the head, quite a few places. And then at a point in transitioning to the second Rupa jhana, when the instruction was given to shift to the second Rupa jhana, something quite extraordinary happens. It's difficult to see here until I separate out. This is the electrode at the crown of the head. So about 20 seconds into trying to develop the second Rupa jhana, everything undergoes a massive suppression of the crown of the head. And then it recovers. And from that point on, the whole recording is dominated by very powerful slow waves. Which again, to begin with, I've got a time scale at the top. So this scale is now 20 seconds at the top. So the time scale here is about the same as the previous one, 10 to 15 seconds. And after a while, they become absolutely dominant at the center of the crown of the head, and very, very strong. Very, very strong, over 1,000, well over 1,000 microvolts. And the distribution on the head for this section marked yellow is like that. So now the crown center is the main source of activity. Everything else is pretty well no longer there. This pale cyan color is the lowest level of intensity. In fact, on the scale goes from plus to minus. In this case, this is the high point is plus 300. The negative points are going into the negative region. The other interesting thing for this meditator is that the further along this develops, the slower the rhythm becomes. So you can see, if I close down the high frequencies, you'll see it better. So now the main peaks are, here's about 35 seconds. That continues to increase. For example, here you've got a couple of very strong peaks, then 3 follow about nearly 100 seconds later. So this is now very different as this person moves through the third, what we might call the third Rupa jhana. Very slow. I should add, when I show you these recordings, that it's a real challenge to meditators to be recorded. And out of the 30 people I recorded, probably about 10 or maybe 12 showed significant slow waves, which I'm pretty sure from the analysis relates to the second Rupa jhana developing from the higher ones. But many of the people I record will comment afterwards when we go through the recording that they're conscious, they're aware that they can't go quite as deep as they might in their daily practice. And it really mustn't be underestimated how tricky it is to be recorded. I know from trying to record myself. It's almost like there's an intruder watching, which there literally is in the person managing the recording. But also the wires, the head cap and the wires on the back of the head, you have to try to put that to one side and settle into the internal stillness. It's actually not easy. I think it's actually a little bit similar to what's talked about in physics, quantum physics, about the observer effect. As soon as you put an observer into a situation, it changes the situation. So what I noticed in recording meditators is that I think to get anywhere near the completion of the fourth Rupa jhana is very difficult. That delicate balance of the fourth Rupa jhana is so sensitive to any intrusion. And then you think of the Arupa jhanas, where I've had almost no luck in recording anyone practicing the Arupa jhanas. I've only one recording, and it was done in a different way, where the person was no third party. The person was shown how to start the recording and then put everything aside and go into the practice, but with an intention to practice for a predetermined predetermined time and then come out. And in that case, there was a very interesting recording. Anyway, Out of those 10 or 12 people who were showing very regular rhythmic slow waves, okay, this is a kind of average of all the activity for those 10 or 12 meditators who were showing the different activity in the second and higher Rupa jhanas. These are three-dimensional plots, actually. This is no longer the surface of the head, it's the actual activity within the cortex of the brain. And there are roughly three groups. There's a group of regions that become active. This is an average across all the meditators. There's a group at the front of the head, which amounts to 24% of the whole activity. There's a group at the back of the head, which accounts for 30% of the total activity. And then at the crown of the head, there is a group which represents 44%. So this is an average. It means that all this group have a mix of sites activity of these regions of the head, and the vertex source is becoming the most dominant. This is the recording. This one down here, the bottom one here, is the recording I just showed you, the live raw data. And this is a recording of the same meditator 3 years before. And the analysis for these two recordings is summarized here. The percentages between 2014 and 2017, the vertex source, the crown source, goes from nearly 100%, it goes from 92.8% up to 99.7%. So this is what I mean, that in Samadhi, eventually nothing is left out. This is the total activity in the brain at this point is almost completely dominated by these very, very powerful slow waves. There's no room for faster sensory consciousness rhythms. Only tiny remnants of the front-back subject-object mechanisms. Very tiny remnants. So what does this mean in terms of consciousness? What it means is that the right-hand picture here, it's a kind of composite. There's the region at the top of the head. Now that area is very strongly connected down through the core of the brain, into the brainstem. And then once it gets into the body, it's very closely, very intimately connected to the whole nervous system of the body, the vagus system, which extends almost like the branches and a tree. And it's related to how the internal organs are managed, the heart, the breathing, and so on. So the samadhi that we're talking about becomes almost certainly a brain or mind body connection. And that fits with what we experience subjectively. This point in our practice, from the time we get familiar with the first Rupa jhana and start to move into the second and higher ones, is embodied. It's a kind of consciousness where we're not thinking of this or that. Most meditators feel the word presence is better, or just open or pure awareness. This on the left here, I'm sure is related, because in the Yoga-Vichara tradition, there's a class of yantra, very, very simple yantras, this is one, which are related to the energy systems that a meditator experiences. And this one is a kind of, behind this class of yantra, they call Natyam, is the symbolism of the embryo, the formation of the cerebrospinal connection of nervous tissue, and then how in meditation the energies are managed from all regions including sexual areas, stomach, abdominal, chest, heart areas, moving upwards and upwards into a vertical axis. Now, how do you prove that this is actually in reality a body connection apart from our subjective experience? And there is a way which is not in the published paper. It depends on how can you measure the nervous system, the vagus system in the body, which is actually in two parts. One is the parasympathetic nervous system and the other is the sympathetic nervous system. There are some of you who already are familiar with those terms. Certainly Francis is. The sympathetic system is related to threat, to action, readiness for action. The adrenaline system is also related to the old part of the brain, the fight, flight. And the parasympathetic is the system where we feel very relaxed. The whole body is functioning very well together. Now, it turns out that these two modes are reflected in the heartbeat. If you look at the heartbeat, and this is where the meditation connects. Some meditators have been recorded while they're doing meditation to record the heartbeat. And the interval between successive beats is not fixed. It varies. And this is called heart rate variability. And it happens that in the sympathetic mode, when someone is tense and ready for action, the interval is almost fixed. It doesn't vary much. Everything is kind of poised, ready to act, or retaliate, or run. Whereas in the parasympathetic mode, the more relaxed mode, the variability increases. It's almost counterintuitive that there's something good about your heart rate being variable. I'm not talking about missing beats here, but I'm just the variability. And this has become a very interesting field of research because people wanting to develop peak performance in sports or any performing arena have discovered that if their heart rate variability increases, they're more flexible, they're more adaptable, less rigid, and perform better. And it turns out like that the meditators that I've recorded so far, before and during meditation, the heart rate variability pretty well doubles, which is a big change, actually. Normally in peak performance, something like 20 or 30% change is not bad. So to double is quite significant. So the idea of Samādhi as a brain, body, mind, body integration, a kind of yoga, is real. So I think that's a good point at which to break and practice for 20 minutes. As I suggested, let go of the idea of stages. Don't worry about where you are. Just let the stillness deepen and see where it takes you. And then at the end, when you come out of meditation, stay with the stillness, which now actually becomes very important when you're doing a practice in this way, because it will tell you the quality of the stillness. If you just stay with the experience, the quality of the stillness will tell you where you've been. Whether it's the first, second, third, fourth, or moving between them, it will tell you where you've been. So I'm going to sound the bell to start practice for about 20 minutes, and then I'll sound the bell at the end of practice. Okay. So as before, if anything comes to mind, feel free to voice it. No need for anyone to reply. Then someone else may do the same, and someone else may do the same, and then we see what comes up.
I was interested in what you said, that the quality of the stillness would tell you where you had been. Partly because it's interesting that I suppose it's no one's aware when the mind is more still. And I'm not sure I've looked quite specifically before at the quality of the stillness, and that is quite interesting, because there is definitely a different quality to different sorts of stillness. And it also, in fact, reminded me of there's some sutta. In fact, they run through various states and then through the jhanas, and say, as you go through them, say each is more peaceful than the one before. So that's the kind of a hallmark.
Experiences of the body. At first, I was very aware that the breathing was going into the body and down and coming out again. But gradually, that sort of, it was almost as though, it's very difficult to explain the experience, but it was as though the body was becoming just lightness, colour, and the breathing was not it felt as though the breathing was not coming necessarily in the usual way, but almost like osmosis, as though the breath was coming into the body in that sort of way. And yeah, it was just a very strange experience of the body and how it changed during the practice.
Yeah, I had, as I went into the practice, I had a very strong, suddenly I had a very strong pressure in my left temple, which was quite interesting because I hurt my right temple recently by shutting a car boot on it. But it felt very strongly in this left temple, and then it sort of evaporated into my body, and I had a real strong sense of an opening, like a door opening. It felt very profoundly peaceful, the quality of the stillness after the opening.
You discussed the way in which the effects of the practice, that activation of the whole of the centre and centre of the head, and the way that spread out through the body in, I can't remember quite your expression, but it was like around the organs, and so a sense of the way in which that then does become embodied in the body. And I was really struck by the way that, you know, over years I've heard, and that sort of sense of trying to take that quality of the practice into the everyday. Like sit at the end of the practice, just having that sense of that body that is completer, nothing left out, that then goes into action. And it just really struck me how important that is, that we don't make, because you can do a sharp break, you can leave something sharply, and whereas there's another way where you carry that quality into life. And that was just, I hadn't really thought about it. Your diagram made me think about how actually, yeah, that's a very real thing. You can see it happening in the body.
Mm.
So the idea of trying to carry some mindfulness, that quality into next action. I just thought, gosh, you know, if that was perfected, how marvelous, how splendid.
While I was doing the meditation, and I thought about when you said you need to let go of the sensory consciousness, and I did feel a point where it was quite still, but then I could still hear all the sounds and the things around me. So I wondered if that is still, if that is part of, I mean, how, when you let go of sensory consciousness, does it mean that you can't hear the things around you?
Say that last bit again, something about you can't hear things around you if you leave sensory consciousness?
Yeah.
Is that what you said?
Yes.
Okay. Well, there's a few things in what everyone's talking about, and so the stillness, there is the connection of that to the jhanas, what you've actually been experiencing. There's the comparison between how, in a way, how different the experiencing jhana is to the experience of sensory consciousness. So we're talking about around the same thing. This way of doing the practice that we're doing now, I think anyone who has been practicing for a couple of years, you know, where you know the 16 stages, and ideally might have done a retreat, but even so, you may have done a couple of weekends. Occasionally, to do it in this way, I think, can be actually very helpful, but not to replace your practice by it, because when we start off, the stages, the 16 stages, the 4 lengths of breath, the counting, following, touching, settling, they're so important in giving us a sense of the whole. Just like it's quite helpful to look at the Bojjhangas to give a sense of the whole picture of the Buddhist path and the jhana factors. So I'm not suggesting leaving that, but it highlights something about the difference between sensory consciousness and what we experience in jhana. Sometimes it feels like the sensory consciousness really intrudes, like what you just mentioned about hearing sounds. Whereas, and then you imagine this should all disappear if I'm not in sensory consciousness. Not quite as simple as that. I'll come back to it in a minute, but staying with the stillness, it's a bit like recollection, but I don't want to use the word recollection, because the problem with the word recollection is it gets contaminated by, again, patterns of the way we think in sensory consciousness, thinking back to detail, to memory, to naming. You know, you can imagine sitting at the end of your practice, going through it, what you did from the beginning through the next stage and so on, not meaning that at all. Staying with the stillness is experiencing the stillness. And it takes some time to get used to it. But already some of the comments that you've made, different people you've made, you're in a way saying something about your practice today. So going back to Francis's question, how do you link it to what you've experienced? If you've been practicing the first Rupa Jhana and you come to very nice stillness, the first Rupa Jhana can be very, very satisfying and peaceful. But when you come out of the first Rupa Jhana, because it's so close to sensory consciousness, you stay with the stillness, and then fairly quickly there'll be a pull back into thinking about it, because that's the nearest position back into sensory consciousness. So coming out of the first Rupa Jhana, it's very easy to just come back into thinking, discrimination. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because what that kind of thinking, when you come out of even the first Rupa Jhana, is usually a lot cleaner, less sticky, less caught up with things to deal with. So it's more fluid. It's actually quite creative. A lot of people who come out of meditation, even the first Rupa Jhana, get a lot of good ideas. You know, and if you have a problem or some business problem or whatever that's been nagging at you, sometimes the solution just pops into your mind. So if you come out of the second Rupa Jhana, how is it different? So the second Rupa Jhana is further away from sensory consciousness. It's further away from Vitakka and Vichara, but it's very much connected with the body. The main jhana factor in the second Rupa Jhana is piti. So in the second Rupa Jhana, we're very sensitive to what's going on in the body. And so when you come out of the second Rupa Jhana, you may have very interesting bodily experiences, which are not so limited by sensory consciousness of thinking about a particular area with a name. It's not a matter of you go back to attention in your shoulder or attention whatever. It's an awareness of your body which is much more the felt sense, which can be quite beautiful. And a lot of things can happen for someone coming out of the second Rupa Jhana. You could describe it like Fran did. You could feel that it's beautiful in the sense of no matter whether you have some physical problem outside meditation, you know, like a strain or an injury. Someone mentioned they'd knocked to their head. In the second Rupa Jhana, where the body is very, very sensitive, then all that can disappear into a deep peace, almost like healing. And in fact, there is a way of developing jhana to deliberately do that, which some of you may have come across in some retreats we've done. Now, if someone comes out of the third Rupa Jhana, then the third Rupa Jhana, the body has been incorporated. It's now a purely mental experience. It doesn't mean the body has disappeared. It's like Vitakka and Vichara before. It means that it's fully integrated and very still. And the experience is of mind, of sukha, deep, deep, peaceful happiness and satisfaction. And so when someone comes out of the third Rupa Jhana, that will stay for quite a while. A kind of happiness that is totally undisturbed. So certainly not back into sensory consciousness. It may stay for quite some time if you have the opportunity to sit with it, not to want to go back into meditation, but this is staying with the stillness. It may stay for some time, and then it may very well go back into the awareness of the body. It sort of goes back one step. And the same things I just talked about with second Rupa jhana will arise. Sensitivity, how you experience the body, the kind of peace in the body. And then finally, when you've had sufficient savoring of all that, then you may come back to thinking and decide it's time to get up and cook yourself some dinner. If you come out to the fourth Rupa jhana, then the difference to the third is very subtle. In fact, the only difference is the question of feeling, of happiness. When the third Rupa jhana comes to fulfillment, then the meditator becomes aware of two things. Being fully conscious is a characteristic of the third Rupa jhana. There's no disturbance to the consciousness at all, fully present, but also deeply satisfied and happy. But as you get towards the completion of the third Rupa jhana, the two things, the samadhi, the balance, the equanimity, and the deep happiness, usually you may sense that you want to just let go of even the disturbance of this happiness and just rest in total balance. And that is the fourth Rupa jhana, the Upeka. Samadhi becomes completely free of any wanting, disturbance, even the satisfaction of being happy doesn't matter. It's possible to keep the balance going without even that satisfaction of happiness. It's sometimes described as neither happy nor unhappy. It's almost on the edge of the neither nor quality of the arupa jhanas, which is why, in a way, it's said that the following four arupa jhanas are developments of or developed from the fourth Rupa jhana. The other thing I'd say about this way of paying attention to the calm, to the stillness, is that, and it connects to what someone just said, I can't remember who it was. In the stillness, there's a possibility of recognizing by direct experience what the quality of these different jhana factors I've just spoken about mean, and what also the difference of sensory consciousness is. And as you stay with the stillness, it becomes part of your body-mind samadhi. Even though you're on the edge of, you're no longer fully in meditation, you're reflecting on it in a very, very subtle way. This connects to how, the first two things we talked about were sati and dhammavichaya. And sati, mindfulness, you add to it the quality of very, very subtle investigation, dhammavichaya. Sati is placing, is almost like the concentration or the samatha quality. The dhammavichaya, the direct understanding, is the quality of insight and eventually wisdom. So at this stage, when you stay with the calmness, the stillness, when you go back into your next practice, the next day or whenever it is, you will find that in the whichever jhana, whichever stage it is, there's a subtle awareness that's developed of knowing where you are. So practicing this in the stillness at the end of practice eventually leads into the practice itself, where there's a quality of knowing and insight, even within the samatha, even within the jhana. It's not that you drop into jhana and everything disappears. It can do, but more often that's something slightly different, maybe vivanga. And the question of hearing sounds, etc., once the absorption is deep enough and the focus and concentration is strong enough in whichever jhana it is, then you may not be aware of sounds at all, but it doesn't mean that they're not very close by and available. So if an emergency came up and someone needed your attention, there'd be no problem in just immediately attending. It's something to do with the strength of concentration, focal awareness, absorption. It's not that they shut down. You know, someone pointed out to me, someone had written that in jhana you lose sensation of the body. That's not quite right. I mean, you may not think about anything as a focal object in the body, but you're very aware from the second rupa jhana on of being embodied. It's just a part of the experience, part of the felt experience.
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to the start of the practice. I just dispensed with the stages and I was just aware of kind of where that was in the structure. I mean, you know, the length of the breath and what I was doing. So I allowed myself to move quite organically. And that instruction to make to not leave anything out, I found quite useful. And because it's almost like instead of struggling with something, it's almost like just allowing something just to be and let it become incorporated. And it just kind of very, very different way of, I don't know how to, it's not quite dealing with something, but it's just, I found it quite surprising at how it just dissolved into the whole thing and just, you could say, purified by itself without having to kind of worry, less faffing about, as it were. Yeah. And it's quite surprising, actually. I found quite early on in the establishing of the working with the agitation and whatever restlessness that was there. So that was quite strong. It was quite marked for me.
Yeah, I had a slightly odd experience in that normally when there's stillness in the mind, the breath seems to become more subtle and fine as well. But in this practice, the opposite happened, that the more the mind felt very still, the more the breath felt obtrusive, like it was in the way. It almost felt sort of, there was too much coarseness. And I remember just kind of wishing the breath would just go away completely.
That point is quite an intriguing one too, because you're right. The breath changes, and while everything starts to become still, the breath becomes almost, it can feel like a subtle disturbance, you know, even when the breath becomes very, very fine. And it can follow its normal course, but sometimes you can get a little bit caught in it. And it can go back almost like you may have felt you missed something and have to re-establish it. It's very much a characteristic of the edges of the second and the third rupa jhana. Being pulled back a bit into, maybe it hasn't become quiet as you might have experienced before. And sometimes there's a little pull around wanting to do something, rather than being able to just trust that it will become still. And if you had longer to practice in your own practice, that's probably what would happen. This is the constraint of just practicing for 20 minutes may have crept into that. But you're quite right. In the development of the stillness, there's awareness of the in-breath and there's awareness of the out-breath. Then gradually it becomes almost like not quite the same idea of breathing in a linear way or up and down or whatever, but someone mentioned it is much more a subtle bodily experience, which can even sometimes feel like you're breathing through your skin. Or even that the breath has become so fine that it only needs a tiny movement to fulfill your bodily needs. So it doesn't totally stop. And at that point, just to keep that subtle mindfulness there can be very helpful, because it goes further. Everything becomes then still, and you don't need to think about the breath, whether it's stopped or not. And then usually at that point you're quite into samadhi, you know. A lot of this, getting used to it, is the difference to sensory consciousness. It's embedded in sensory consciousness that things occur in a time sequence. A leads to B, leads to C, leads to D. We have ideas of going deeper, going forwards. We have ideas of failing at that and regressing backwards. We have ideas of going higher, you know, to a higher jhana, or all that is sensory consciousness, the way we try to position and decide what this is and what that is, and how they differ. But in jhana, is no longer necessary. It's not, it's a different experience. We don't need those anchors of up, down, backwards and forwards. So it's almost like the jhanas themselves. Are they separate? You know? Or are they something like superposed possibilities where you can dive deeper into something which is increasingly still? In that sense, the only real perfect jhana is the fourth group of jhana. And it's interesting the comment Francis made about, which I haven't come across before, well, I may have done a long, long time ago, but I've forgotten it, about practicing the jhanas, each one, I think you said, is experienced as more peaceful. And seeing that as a quality of the stillness.
I found that though the object, as it were, became the stillness, or what was associated with the stillness, that there was still some awareness of the length of breath, and that seemed to, and there were sort of moments when that usefully seemed to need to change. And it was interesting, it became clear that though sometimes it needed to change when some slight distraction started to come in. And that as soon as it changed, then the mind became more still, more peaceful.
Mm. Mm.
I'm intrigued, Paul, that you haven't used the word nimitta. But you've spoken a lot about the quality of feeling.
Mm.
And I'm wondering if they are the same thing in a way.
Mm. Mm. Good, you know, it's very clever of you to point that out. I hadn't actually noticed that, but you're right. I think it's one of those things in nimitta, people get hooked on it and caught up in trying to place it, you know, in terms of almost like a sensory object, or I mean, I do talk about the nimitta quite a lot on other occasions. But it is interesting that it hasn't come up much in this one. And I guess it is because I was more concerned, without really thinking it through, to talk about the quality of the stillness, around which everything is in that. Someone mentioned earlier on that there's a quality of brightness. Another person may be aware of a sense of that one's tangible quality to the stillness, almost like a very, very subtle touch, maybe touching something with the mind. I think maybe the reason I avoided talking too much about the nimitta is I don't want to fix anything.
I was just going to say, I was really struck by the image of the Naga, particularly the one in Laos with the great teeth. Or like, it was really interesting, you know, the sense of stillness and quality of stillness and something quite almost ferocious.
You like it?
I did like it. I did actually. I really liked it. And I think it gave me a sense of that sense of real warmth and safety in Samādhi.
Including ferocious?
Well, because it was a protection.
Yeah.
And it just made you realize protection is needed.
Yeah.
You know, whether you could say it was protection of Sila or whether protection it was protection of Sila in a way, because nobody would come and harm him, you know, sitting in Samādhi. But
yeah.
Whether you call it your own Sila, but it was quite interesting because there's quite a lot of activity going on around me during the practice. There's conversations and it allowed something to still have a sense of, you could still develop that Samādhi, even despite the fact that you could be aware of, there was no engagement with the other activities, no emotional engagement or almost interest. It was just quite neutral. And it was just, yeah.
That's a good example, the way you just put that, of how sensory consciousness can be nearby to that extent of being aware of something, but it doesn't intrude on the stillness. It doesn't intrude on, you don't attach to it. That's right. But also the other thing about the fearlessness or the quality of safety is quite a good thing to point that out, because it's a big thing to separate from sensory consciousness. You know, every one of you, all of us, will remember, you know, the difficulty of just the early stages of the practice, wanting to know where we are, what's going on, and suddenly catching ourselves, talking to ourselves or thinking, you know, then having to bring it back to the breath. But that gets more and more subtle. And finally, you know, the thresholds become very delicate. And if you're in a group, it's a big help. But sometimes, if things happen too quickly, then you could become a little bit afraid. So someone who's got not a very secure sense of I to begin with has to be careful. We're very lucky in Samādhi because I think we've got a very supportive Sangha. The way local groups run, the way teachers care about the people they teach, the way courses are run, is a very kind of caring, supportive endeavour. And even here online, you're not with the other people in the group, but you can kind of sense it. And so we feel quite secure, quite safe. And then the more you get into Samādhi, it becomes real, that nothing can really hurt you. Nothing, no longer anything to be afraid of.
I just wondered, quite often in the practice, I'll have sensations actually in my head, physical sensations, and they're not always in the same place. And is that just kind of some sort of tension in the scalp, or is it actually a reflection of what's happening with the brain waves that you've talked about before?
Whereabouts in the head, Sue?
Sort of round the back and then around the top, and sometimes right on the crown as well.
Okay. Painful, pleasant?
Pardon?
Will you say painful or pleasant?
Oh no, subtle, not even a vibration really, just an awareness of that.
Oh, okay, yeah. Yeah. I mean, the reason I was asking is that sometimes when you look at the EEG of a meditator, you can pick up muscle tension, and it's usually around the shoulders going up into this area of the head. And gradually, as they meditate, it might settle down. But if someone's got not a very good posture, it can persist. What you're talking about is more the the more kind of subtle effects in the body of where you're at in the practice.
Right.
And the crown center, sometimes it becomes so strong that of course people feel it. And you hear descriptions of meditators talking, even from quite early on when they take up the practice, of imagining or feeling. Imagining is a wrong word because there's some reality to it. The kind of sensations sometimes sweeping across the head, front to back, or the sense that you've got a very delicate cap on the top of the head. And I don't think this is isolated to Buddhist practice of jhana. I mean, why in the Jewish religion do people wear a yarmulke on top of the head? And things like that. There's some sensitivity around that area when someone comes into either through jhana or into a deep state of engagement with something deeply satisfying. Maybe someone who's very creative, working with a really creative piece of work, probably might get a glimmer of the same thing.
Do you find that at times the heart actually really slows down? I sort of had a little peek at it, and it just seemed that it was slowing down quite a lot.
Yeah, it does. I don't know whether I've got it here on one of the slides or not. This is one of the recordings of the heartbeat for a meditator. These are the consecutive beats. They're called R peaks, and it's the interval which sets your heart rate. There may be 60 R peaks a minute or 70. And this is the heart rate variability we measure, or is measured in heart rate variability. And without going into details, these plots are one way of describing the kind of two-dimensional way the variability goes. This is a person on the left before meditation, and this is the same person a few minutes later, quite into meditation. The fact that it's shifted up towards this top corner means the heart rate has slowed from about, you can work it out from where it is here. It's slowed significantly. That's the actual pulse rate. So as you're saying, it will slow. The spread also increases, and that's the heart rate variability. It's just about double compared to the original plot. Or you can do it a different way. These two here are before meditation for two different meditators. These are several minutes in, and the level here is on average just under 20. Here it's hovering around 40. So yeah, your heart rate will slow.
So I didn't want to raise this earlier because it is more like a technical question and you seemed a little reluctant to elaborate on nimitta, but I wondered if you'd seen any electrophysiological signal that you could correlate with the onset of nimitta prior to the arising of jhana.
Any you're thinking of in particular?
I was thinking of a visual nimitta in particular, yes.
You mean how you could notice whether someone is experiencing a nimitta from a physiological signal?
Yes, I wondered if you'd seen anything in the recordings that could correlate with that. I realize it's difficult because they'd almost have to be able to tell you what they were experiencing. I guess that in itself would probably make the experience go away. So it may be a silly question, but I just wondered.
No, I mean, it's an interesting question because it shows exactly that question, that difficulty about coming out of the direct experience and trying to put words on it. I mean, if you're thinking about the nimitta, it's it often becomes clear when people are reporting on their meditation how they experience, what their experience in the meditation is the kind of answer to that question. What, as far as physiological signs go, I can't quite imagine any that would capture it. But some people are much more visual, and some people are much more auditory or tactile. And then maybe some people, it's very, very subtle and it doesn't quite appear clearly anyway, but it's felt in the stillness. But we did a survey at one point to try and correlate it with whether people, with meditators might be, where they stood on a kind of distinction between visual, auditory, and kinesthetic. There's a questionnaire called the VAK questionnaire. And there's some correlation between what they experienced in meditation and how they answer the questionnaire. I mean, basically what it is when you turn away from outward sensory consciousness, our inner world still has the habit of using those internal sense bases as a way of formulating our experience. And that's quite sticky. In a way, probably why I haven't mentioned it much in these talks is like the dropping of the labels of Bhojjhangas. Maybe it's also quite helpful to drop the too much needing to recognize the nimitta rather than just experience it through the quality of the stillness. Yeah. No, the only kind of physiological measures that I've managed to do is to measure respiration and to measure heart rate.
With the kinesthetic kind of nimitta, is there a confusion, a risk of confusion of that with very strong piti?
With
very strong piti. I mean, if you have very strong piti, is that potentially confusable with a nimitta? I mean, is there a clear distinction?
I don't think so. I mean, when I use the word kinesthetic for the nimitta, it's almost like rather than having a sense of seeing something visually, which could be just diffuse light or bright light or limited light or not limited light, the person who tends to operate through hearing will tend to get a kind of spacious feeling, almost like they're listening to silence. When I use the word kinesthetic, it's more like the sensation is of you're giving attention to something, you're not quite sure what the nimitta is, but it's almost like you become aware of touching something with the mind. Not at all disturbed like piti. At all, not at all. Piti, in the sense of that any kind of strong piti or disturbance, is still at quite an early stage of meditation in developing the second rupa jhana. And you can develop the beginnings of the second rupa jhana with still quite strong piti. But one of the recordings I showed you earlier was someone who was exactly doing that and doing pretty well with getting into the full development of second rupa jhana, very slow activity. But then there'd be moments where piti became a little bit strong, or the energy became a little bit out of balance. You remember those spike waves at the bottom. Whereas you then go further into the third rupa jhana, no more piti, no more disturbance. But it's a very energetic, strong state, but it's no more disturbance. You know, the very strong piti that some people get is a real interesting learning experience. Woman's experience would have been, and I've seen it to some extent in temples, some rural temples still, you could notice novice monks. And Naibuman started as a novice monk when he was 16. And I remember one group where the senior monks were doing a particular form of chanting, which plays on the nerves and the sensory system of the body, and is very strong, very effective at arousing piti. And some of the young novice monks were almost lifting off the floor with this feeling. You could really connect to it. Their faces were lit up, very, very strong. Then you become interested in PT. And mostly the older monks in the old traditions were quite happy to see that kind of interest developing, even though it could become a bit confused sometimes. But usually the novice monks would get older, and then they'd realize what it really means in terms of the body becoming part of meditation. And they would master it, and it's no longer a problem. I remember Naibuman saying at one point about when it comes, that at that point, potentially there are two directions. It can be understood and incorporated into Samadhi and jhana. But if not, it becomes an obstacle to jhana. And sometimes it can become a kind of slightly negative path, because we read too much into it, become confused. So we're coming up to 12 o'clock. So I think that's an opportune moment for me to sign off. So I shall say goodbye. We've got one more talk next Saturday on Viveka.
Thank you now. Thank you.